Howdy, it's me, your little Glaceon friend again. Rise the name. I have been thinking about graphics. Ah yes, graphics. It's always been all the hype. In some cases when we were younger and definitely edgier, all we needed to know about whether the game was enjoyable or hot garbage was to determine, hey, does it look good enough for me to care? In modern times I see more of, as long as it runs in 30 FPS, it works well enough for me. Which to that I rephrase, I sure love completely cooking my low-end graphics card for the sake of experiencing eye candy. Now that I am out of the age group where this is typically most observed in, I think it is a good time to talk about more primitive graphics. You know, one thing that I find myself often memorized by is Vib-Ribbon's graphics. Yep, I'm talking about those vectorized yet also rasterized graphics? Actually, minor correction. It's not just the raster-vector combo thing going on here. It is everything about the graphical side of things. Back in Vib-Ribbon's day, the game was sometimes criticized for how simplistic its graphics were, because even in the era of this thing, graphics was still a relatively big focus. This topic was still enough to drive people away from trying new things. Who knew? Even then, many of us Vibsters found this to be part of what made this game, honestly, so charming. I argued that the game wasn't afraid to be different from the crowd because, who needs any of those solid polygons? All we need is mostly white poly lines. The game has its own way of making things work, and work it did. It provided the perfect visual feel of the Vib-Ribbon challenge. If you're like me, with a little bit of PS1 knowledge under their sleeve, and a plethora of lost sleep hours, you would definitely be one to overanalyze this intriguing thing. I mean, hey, that's why I make these videos. It's just a fun thing to do instead of preparing for the ACT. To be fair, I gotta put that information to use for something. Hope that's going well. Other than that, once we know more about the way Vib-Ribbon pulls off its graphical quirks, I can half assure that you will too be mesmerized. Not guaranteed, of course. It's time to get into the tech, aka the fun part. Maybe we should start broad. Consequently, before we continue, I think it would be a good idea to look into what the modeling format used in Vib-Ribbon is. The PlayStation has a variety of ways to display models in their games. This includes RSD, HMD, and the focus for this video, TMD. To begin with, a TMD file contains 3D model data that is supported by the PlayStation's libGS graphics library. A neat quirk to this format is that it is able to be carried over to system memory. The ability to copy its data over to RAM is crucial when it comes to a game such as this. As I have said in other videos before, this is what helps make the whole CD swap gimmick thing work. Several of these models are stored in system memory. Luckily, these models tend to be mere kilobytes large, so they fit snugly into there just fine. There are a few components that make up a TMD file: a header, object tables, and the 3 data entities housed within them. We will cover these one by one, so that we will have a clear understanding of what exactly we are getting into. Naturally, we will start with the first thing on this list, the header. To be frank, the header is not too interesting of a TMD component, but it is typically made of a 12-byte sequence. These 12 bytes are there for giving data structure to the PlayStation models. In these 12 mere bytes, there are 3 subcomponents: version identification, flags, and the number of objects in the file. The version identification is there because this may suggest that there have been different iterations of such during the console's lifespan. This indication takes up about a third of the header. The next portion of the header is the flags. Interestingly, not much is usually done with this portion, as in typical cases, most of the bits in this area are set to 0, although this can be useful for data configuration and object validation. The most important, arguably, is the number of objects in the file. For context, many of these TMD files are split into portions, which can be useful for animation. This is similar to how in Super Mario 64, well, a Nintendo 64 game, yeah, I know, his body parts are separated and can be put together to make one full being. Back on the PlayStation side, in Vib-Ribbon's case, all of what Vibri needs for that form specifically all come from a singular TMD file. Portions of this file can be used at any time. Case in point, it wouldn't be at all useful to have these tear puddles visible when she sleeps in the game menu, though this has the ability to be hidden. This is possible in part by the direct definition of how many objects are present in this TMD file. All in all, it performs the same technique as exists in Super Mario 64. Now, the number of objects is also useful for something else, even more so in fact. This leads us to the object table of the TMD file, the second item in the top-level hierarchy. In the same section, we would also have to define, well, the rest. Take this as one whole topic, if you will. In addition to the number of objects as defined in the header section, each object is modeled for each open structure. In each object structure, pointer information is available, and it helps indicate where the model data for it is located. Within this object, it can list the number of vertices, as well as the number of normals and primitives. Start addresses would also need to be indicated so that the correct data can be passed through. Now, when I talk about primitives, normals, and vertices, what do you think of? IBM 8088, not you? And what the hell are you talking about? Good to hear, because we are going to go through some vocabulary. It's a mini glossary. First, we should probably look at the primitive. But what is a primitive? From a semi-philosophical perspective, it is a thing that exists in a TMD model. It can be what can be drawn on the screen. They are the structural elements of something. By drawing these primitives inside the model, it also gets converted to drawing data that is handled by the graphics chip. More about the GPU rendering later. If you want to skip to it, here's a cool looking timecode. It looks nice. Until then, let's learn more about what a primitive is capable of. Firstly, a primitive can have different modes, which is defined by the first 3 bits of the mode byte. The mode byte defines what type of primitive will be used. 001 meaning a polygon, 010 meaning a line, and 011 meaning a sprite. The rest of the bits in that byte can control other settings for this primitive. The next byte has 3 more options. This is the primitive's flag byte, which more directly affects how their primitive will appear. This byte allows for gradients on non-textured polygons and light source calculation, also known as shading. It also allows for single-face polygons, meaning that it can be visible from one side only. For example, Vibri's eyes are one-sided, meaning that can be visible from the front, but not the back. Next, there are 2 bytes that indicate how long this primitive is in the number of words. This way, invalid data is prevented. Most important of all, after all of that setup, only then are we able to actually put down our data, the parameters for our vertices and normals. Vertices, singularly a vertex, is a point in 3D space. They can be manipulated along the X, Y, and Z axis. Many of these vertices are needed to make up a singular model. In the olden days of the PlayStation, hundreds of these would usually be needed to make up one character. Nowadays, most can easily use thousands or even tens of thousands on higher-end titles. With the release of Unreal Engine 5, we could potentially be seeing even more in the near future. Anyways, each vertex needs a 16-bit integer sequence that indicates the X, Y, and Z locations. Vertices are also useful for making up a type of normal. Oh, the normal. It needs a little bit more context than that. In 3D modeling, a normal defines what orientation a face or vertex is facing. This can help determine how the object handles shading. In the PlayStation, there are two ways that shading can be handled through the use of normals. In flat shading, one normal is needed for the entire face, whereas in Go Rod shading, each vertex has its own normal applied to it, for a smoother method of shading. But this is just general information about the TMD format in the PlayStation. What does any of this have to do with Vib-Ribbon? Why do you always have to make everything so unnecessarily long? Oh, not so fast. I did this because this is the model format that the game takes to its full advantage. This is utilized in pretty much every single graphic in the game, except for the opening logos before the title screen. This ranges from characters to shapes to obstacles to even every single letter in the menus. Seriously, it's located within font.tmd, and it has every symbol it needs and stuff. Almost everything is a TMD. But what makes these models so special? Look a bit closer for a minute. What could be so different between this and that? Remember how the models are made out of a list of primitives? That is because the vast majority of the objects uses only one of these primitives, the line. Just like how carbon makes up all of us living things, the line primitive is everywhere. But there is one little downside to this that brings up a new challenge. Considering that we are in a modern 3D environment, a line isn't visible, it's just there. And as a result, in most places, one of these complete models either looks like just a singular face floating in the air or just nothing at all. The model would be invisible. This also means that things like normals are not very important at all, as it is intended to be used on polygons and stuff. This is made out of polylines, and even the few polygons that are in the model for God knows why, it would blend in with the environment because it and the background are basically the same color. So yeah, that is kinda worrying. If we can't see the model in most modeling editing tools without turning on the wireframe somehow, there has to be a way that the system draws the thing. I tell you, the models themselves are invisible! I spent a while looking for an answer to this, but eventually I found it. And it was right under my nose the whole time. Wait, hold on one second. Oh no. For just a moment, let's take a quick look at the GPU. Did you know that the GPU is able to do some draw functions? As a GPU should do, it is used to draw 3D polygons onto our 2D screens by processing instructions from the CPU into the frame buffer, primitive by primitive. Yeah, that is literally how obvious it was. I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out. But what got me was how different it was compared to most 3D PlayStation games of the era. With most of these games, it was a solid shape, like it was all filled in and stuff. This does not seem to be the case for Vib-Ribbon, however, because, well, if you're not blind, everything is made out of non-solidly filled shapes. Lines. There are a few types of primitives that the PlayStation's GPU can draw. It's a callback to that TMD thing we looked over previously. The graphics chip also relies on primitives, except in this particular case, it is a bit different. For review, we have things such as polygons and lines, and in addition to this, for the situation where we are developing a two-dimensional environment, this compatible primitive list also includes sprites for GPU rendering. Two of these primitives can have textures applied to them, you know, so that they look nice. Alternatively, each of these primitives have their own color settings for the case that, let's say you want to turn a quadrilateral red or something. Ooh. But we're not done yet, because there is a whole other chip in addition to the GPU that handles other things in the PS1. Hey, what's this? The Geometry Transformation Engine. That's perspective and stuff. We'll also get to this after we finish whatever the GPU is doing over there. For now, just know that this is very useful. We already know well enough that the line primitive is the basis of all the graphics in Vib-Ribbon, so I'm gonna have to take this into the interrogation room. What are you? Okay, the render line command is free to leave. It has told me everything that I needed to know. The polygons and line primitives have a sequence of words that help build it from the ground up. We already know that the line primitive functions a little bit differently than its shape counterparts. So, how does the GPU handle the situation at hand? Instead, not only do vertices need to be defined, but we also need to define a color to be assigned to it. In Vib-Ribbon, most of the lines are white anyway, so they are defined as such. In order for a line to be, well, a line, 2 vertex words would have to be written. Each of the vertex words are split into 2 sections. Each of these half words, being assigned 16-bit values, indicate where it should be on the Y and the X-axis in that order. If you have 3 or more of these instructions, then ta-da! You just made a polyline shape. Almost. But we need to keep 2 things in mind before we are considered done with this polyline shape. For one, it would probably be useful for a triangle to have 4 vertex points. Why? Well, that's because it needs to go back to its starting point. And to do that, we would need to define the final vertex to have the same coordinates as the first one. Secondly, each shape needs to end at some point, which is simply defined by a terminator value. Although each point tends to shake around, which definitely isn't part of these vertex words by themselves, so these points are basically changing constantly. So what's with that? This is the part where we take this to the GTE. Think about it for a second now. What type of transformation does a shaking object need in order to do its job? If you said that it needs rotation, Anyways, yes, it needs to translate the points. These translation commands contain transformation along the X, Y, and Z axes. The endpoints of each line to be drawn is first gone through some sort of formula. This is where the GTE comes in. And this is quite simply some quick randomization ranges. How wonderful! The home points are stored, basically the locations of said points in the situation where there is no shaking effect whatsoever, and some random number is appended to each and every single point every frame, whether that be positive or negative. Of course, that is an overcomplicated way of saying it is a randomization range. Ha! To make sure the points do not get lost and inevitably venture off into Neverland, the point is then reset to its home spot, and another transformation then takes place on the next frame of output. The amount of randomness the points can have can vary drastically. Let's look at a few examples. Example 1. Imagine this. You are doing a subpar job at some level in a Discord voice chat. The ramblings about utter nonsense do not help the situation whatsoever. And now the screen is shaking around like crazy. Notice that the more intense randomness is achieved by a slightly larger range of motion of these points. There are a few of these instances defined within each of the major forms of Vibri, depending on how awful you are doing on the course. Example 2. If you have looked close enough at some things in the game, you may have noticed that the transitions to other areas of the game other than the one you are currently viewing consist of a whole bunch of lines across the screen. When I first noticed this over a year ago, I thought it was just something it did with a separate model or something, but I was mistaken. If we slow down some footage of one of these transitions, we begin to notice that the jumble of lines is actually the models that were loaded in previously. This is due to really high randomization ranges for drawn points. But here's the thing, as the transition progresses, we can notice that the randomization expands more and more over time. The ranges change. Henceforth, this proves that a range can change over time to make up certain visuals in the game, such as this. Example 3. Here's a more specific situation because there is another point, that I need to mention. Let's say you ran out of time in a speed mode course for whatever reason. Take one close look at the game over screen for that real quick. Now let's analyze it. For one, it is harder to notice. but we do see Vib-Ribbon starting to take shape as the object changes from a clumped ball to herself. This is yet another example of randomization range changes in effect. But now, we're going to have to think about something. On this frame, for example, how come Vib-Ribbon is still super shaky and all that jazz, yet this game over text looks normal? I mean, with an answer so facile, I really don't need to get into that much, but I will anyway. It merely just depends on the object being rendered. On a per-object basis, each has its own personal range, so that one shaky object doesn't turn it into a mess or something. So yeah, it really just comes down to how the game controls the RNG on the fly, and it pulls it off very well. It just makes the game that much more unique with its visual aspects. This concept even continued into the PS2 sequel, Vib-Ribbon, but even then, not too many people, even from the Vib-Ribbon community, even pay attention to that game very much. So let's just conclude what we know about all of this so far. The decent amount of variety of file formats the console uses can be adapted for many different environments, whether that be flat or jam-packed full of form. Vib-Ribbon serves as a prime example of how these tools can be transformed in a unique way while making it work well for the system. And combine it with a few more details here and there, and then bada boom, now you have a cult classic just waiting to happen. Shoutouts to the PSX dev community for solidifying some of the information that I was able to retain going into writing this video. Given enough context because of my poorer social skills, they were able to answer the questions that I had, especially about normals. Like, good God, for me, they were a tough nut to crack. And in the end, I did it. I learned more useless information about things. That's a win right there. I believe I must leave now, but until I come back, I want to give you a friendly reminder. This stop sign has 8 fantastic sides and 8 awesome angles. Oh hey, a Twitter handle. That's cool. Anyways, bye.